الله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين المبعوث رحمة للعالمين شفيع المذنبين وحبيب قلوب الصادقين سيدنا ومولانا أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد وعلى أهل بيته الأطيبين الأطهرين الهداة المهديين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم إلى قيام يوم الدين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Inshallah, today we will continue our discussion of the ibadat and the acts of worship that we have been taught in Islam and how we can better practice and appreciate them. I had mentioned earlier that there is a hadith which is attributed to several of our Imams, Imam Baqir, Imam Sadiq alayhi salatu wasalam, in which they have stated that Islam is based upon 5 basic pillars. Buniya al-Islamu ala khams. There are 5 pillars that are the basis of Islam. 4 of them are acts of worship that we are familiar with, salat and Sawm, and Hajj and Zakat. Today we will talk about Zakat, and the 5th pillar is Wilaya, which is the relationship of obedience to Allah by recognizing Tawheed and the attributes of Allah, and then through our obedience to Allah, our relationship to the Prophet, and after the Prophet to Ahlul Bayt. So Wilaya is a very comprehensive concept which includes Tawheed and includes our obedience to the religious leadership that Allah has appointed for our guidance and for the organization of our religious affairs. So there are 5 principles that are the foundation of Islam, and if we look at them, including wilaya, the majority of them pertain to our spiritual and our ritual acts. So salat is an act of worship. Sawm is an act of worship. Hajj is an act of worship. Wilaya, with its comprehensive meaning, includes acts of worship, and it also includes other areas of our life. But there is something unique about Zakat. Zakat seems to not really be an act of worship. If you look at it superficially, it seems to be a monetary obligation, or if not just monetary, an obligation on assets, a tax, so to speak, or a form of mandatory almsgiving or charity. We would think that there is a difference between zakat and prayer and fasting and pilgrimage on the other side. It might seem odd that it would be included in this hadith. But there is a connection which the Quran and which a hadith have affirmed, and a link between zakat and salat in particular, and our other acts of worship. And that is why, as a Muslim, if zakat is an obligation that I have, I cannot fulfill that obligation by simply paying the amount of obligation that I owe to Allah or that I owe to the recipients of zakat. If I do so, unhappily or unwillingly, then it doesn't count. Because zakat is an act of worship. And like any other act of worship, it requires an intention in order to be valid. So I can pay my taxes without wanting to do so, but because it is a legal requirement, and without any intention and without any belief that I want to support the policies of the government that I am paying taxes to. But when it comes to zakat, it is not just a monetary obligation. In fact, because the intention is essential, it is not even primarily an obligation that goes to our financial or our monetary resources. It is an obligation that devolves upon us as individuals in order to serve Allah and in order to purify ourselves. And that is what zakat literally means. The word zakat is from the same root as the word tazkiyah, and it means the same thing as tahara or tathir, purification. The reason why zakat would be included as an act of worship has been explained by Ghazali, a well-known scholar of Islamic thought, and the source of a commentary written by one of our Shi'i ulama, Fayyid Kashani, on the ahadith of Ahlul Bayt and on the ethical principles of Islam. He says that you can look at the philosophy of zakat in terms of three dimensions. In the first place, Tawheed means that you worship only Allah. But Tawheed is a principle that naturally results in a demonstration. It requires a demonstration. If you worship only Allah, that means that you should love only Allah. And you can only really demonstrate that and prove that if you have removed love of everything else from your life and from your practice. If practically we have an attachment and an affiliation to other things, then there is a deficiency in our tawheed. There is a deficiency in our attachment to and our worship of Allah. So zakat is an act of worship because it does prove and demonstrate and strengthen our tawheed, our detachment from the material world, and therefore our attachment to Allah. So it might seem like it is something separate from prayer. It might seem like it is separate from Psalm. But that is the reality of all of our acts of worship to increase our appreciation of Tawheed. There is a verse of Quran in Surah At-Tawbah in which we read, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Inna Allah ashtara min al-mu'minina anfusahum wa amwalahum bi anna lahumul jannah. That Allah has purchased from the believers their souls and all that they own, all of their assets, in exchange for giving them Jannah. Now, commentators have often said that this verse is first and foremost about jihad, about struggling in the way of Allah and being ready to sacrifice one's life and one's possessions and being able to defend Islam and defend the truth. But if Tawheed requires, and if that relationship with Allah requires us to be ready to sacrifice our life, then wealth, possessions, that is something that it should be even easier for us to sacrifice. Sometimes it is reversed. People are more willing to risk their lives and their well-being than to risk their assets and their possessions. But logically, if Islam calls on us and says that the price of Tawheed or the meaning of Tawheed is that you be willing to give yourself up, that should mean that we should find it even easier to give our possessions. So one level is that Tawheed is strengthened and it is something that we practice when we give zakat. We give up our material possessions to symbolize that it is Allah whose pleasure and whose service we consider more important than everything else. A second dimension is that zakat purifies us in terms of our own soul and our own attributes as well. Our ethical makeup, our ethical constitution is purified and becomes zaki or becomes tahir through zakat. And that is because stinginess is an attribute that is innate to human beings. There is a growth process that we go through in order to learn altruism. But for our material existence, for the animal level of our existence, to be stingy, to be reluctant to give up what we have power and control over, that is necessary, essential for us to flourish and for us to exist. As human beings, though, we want to polish that low nature in order to appreciate and to develop an ability to be altruistic, in order to be able to put others first. And that is the meaning of zakat. I will mention the hadith later on, which is mentioned by our imams. So it purifies our makeup as a human being, to go beyond that animal level, to go beyond that very basic level of being stingy. And that is also mentioned in a verse of Quran in Surah Al-Hashr. Allah says that وَمَنْ يُوقَ شُحَّ نَفْسِهِ أُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُفْلِحُونَ, that those who have been protected from that shuh, that stinginess that exists within a human being. And that is not a mistake that Allah left, performed a spiritual surgery and left some kind of tool within the body that was created within us to fulfill a certain need. But in order for us to progress, we have to move beyond it. So zakat is how we can make ourselves a purer and a better person. It corrects our relationship with Allah. It corrects the constitution of our own spirit and our own soul. And then the third level is that it is a symbol of gratitude. If gratitude to Allah is absent from our lives, then there is no amount of physical assets that can ever bring us happiness or contentment. If we don't have gratitude to Allah, then we will never be content, because there is always someone who has more than we do, or there is always within our mind the possibility of having more than we do. We will always become more and more covetous. That sense of gratitude, a sense of gratitude is beneficial even if it's not gratitude to Allah, even if it's just a spirit of gratitude. But gratitude to Allah is what animates a believer and which is deserving of reward, and that is an act of worship. So on every level, zakat purifies and it brings us closer to Allah. And that is why it is deserving of a place among the other acts of worship. We should never think of zakat primarily in financial terms. We should never think of it as to how it's going to affect our bottom line. We should never think of it in material terms. If we do so, we will miss the entire point. We might be able to perform a superficial act of charity, and that might feed someone who is hungry. It might clothe somebody who is in need of assistance. But it will not have any of that spiritual reward, and it will not be a source for the purification of our body and our spirit. So that is what we are seeking with zakat. The importance of zakat, if we understand it not just as a means of helping others in humanity, but as improving our own state and becoming closer to Allah, is something which is equal to prayer. In a sense, it has been equated with prayer. There is a hadith from our sixth Imam, Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam. He says that إن الزكاة ليس يحمد بها صاحبها وإنما هو شيء ظاهر إنما حقن بها دمه وسمي مسلما. Don't think that zakat is something that you can get praise for. And now zakat in a general sense, it includes our Islamic taxes and it includes khums. It's not zakat versus khums. That is a legal definition that we have in terms of the laws of different types of Islamic obligations. But sadaqah in a general sense can include zakat, even if the specific meaning of sadaqah that we use in fiqh and in our common usage is separate from zakat. Zakat also has a comprehensive meaning, and then it has specific forms which can have different legal requirements. This principle is something which is not limited to zakat, but it's something which we might be more susceptible to becoming self-satisfied with. So fasting, because it essentially teaches us humility, it is possible to become self-satisfied with our fasting. But then you would have to be a very odd person to engage in an act of devotion and then become arrogant after it. The outward form of fasting facilitates humility, even if some people do become arrogant after fasting. The outward act of prayer facilitates humility, because you are bowing down and putting your head and rubbing your forehead and your nose on the ground and making it dusty. That should facilitate humility, even though there are people who become arrogant after praying. But that is something which is unexpected. Hajj also is a pilgrimage, a movement from one place to another as an act of devotion, as an act of love. That facilitates humility. Zakat also, as an act of worship, as I have explained, should facilitate humility, but then there is also that element of it where you are giving something to somebody else. And they might have gratitude to you. You might feel that if it weren't for me, this person would go hungry tonight. And so even though properly understood, zakat should facilitate a sense of humility, there is that fear that a person might get distracted because the outward form also has something which might remove that humility. And that is why within the adab of zakat, there are important elements that we should keep in mind to preserve our humility, so we don't fulfill an obligation to Allah, but then become arrogant. So the Imam is reminding us that even though you might think that you are helping somebody, even though you might think that this is something which is a credit that goes to you, zakat is not something that a person should be praised for. Because if it weren't for your giving zakat, then properly speaking, Islamically speaking, you wouldn't be worthy of life. Now, that's not to say that it is a capital offense and a person would come and be sentenced to death. But in terms of the intrinsic value of a person, if I don't pray, I am not worthy of life. If I don't give zakat, I am not worthy of life, because life was given to me as a trust. And it's only if I fulfill the trust that I am worthy of what was entrusted to me. If I'm not willing to fulfill it, then that means that I am not worthy of it. So it's not that somebody else will come and has a right to chop off my head. That's not the point. But I should understand that I am only worthy of that trust to the extent that I am willing to uphold it. If I entrust something, if I have a pet bird and I give it to my neighbor to look after when I go for vacation, and I find out that that neighbor is not going to clean the cage and is not going to give water and going to give bird feed, then I won't trust my animal to that neighbor again. So a human being who has been given a much more valuable trust is only worthy of that trust, life, if they are going to fulfill it. So the Imam says that zakat is something that you are making yourself worthy of breathing this air and drinking this water and walking on this earth. How much credit do you want to give yourself for doing those things? Hopefully we realize that that is something that we are paying a debt. We are not putting somebody else in our debt. We are not putting Allah in our debt. إِنَّمَا حَقَنَ بِهَا دَمَهُ وَسُمِّيَ مُسْلِمًا وَلَوْ لَمْ يُؤَدِّهَا لَمْ تُقْبَلْ لَهُ صَلَاةٌ. And if a person didn't give zakat, then they wouldn't also be able to pray. Because the Quran says, أَقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةَ وَآتُوا الزَّكَاةَ. They are together. You establish prayer and you pay zakat. And if you don't do one, then you cannot do the other. The Imam says that وَإِنَّ عَلَيْكُمْ فِي أَمْوَالِكُمْ غَيْرَ الزَّكَاةِ. Your wealth has an obligation that you have to pay in addition to zakat. Zakat is not all that you are liable for. So don't think that zakat is something that is going to give you honor in the eyes of Allah, that it is going to give you a great deal of credit. That is a debt that you are paying. There is a hadith of Imam Muhammad Baqir alayhi salatu wassalam. He says that إِنَّ اللَّهَ تَبَارَكَ وَتَعَالَى قَرَنَ الزَّكَاةَ بِالصَّلَاةِ فَقَامَ أَقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةَ وَآتُوا الزَّكَاةَ فَمَنْ أَقَامَ الصَّلَاةَ وَلَمْ يُؤْتِ الزَّكَاةَ فَكَأَنَّهُ لَمْ يُقِمِ الصَّلَاةَ. A person who doesn't pay zakat, it is as if they have not prayed at all. And there is a very clear harm that will come to us if we avoid these obligations that we have to Allah. Because there is a financial element to zakat. And because that zakat also is meant to provide a benefit to society, to those who are in need, to those who are deprived, we do want to have an appreciation of the material effects of zakat as well. So Allah wants us to do it for His sake. He wants us to do it as an act of worship and in order to have the correct intention. But because there is also an element of helping other people, if people do not pay zakat, the harm that comes to society is much more immediate and direct than if I miss a prayer. I might make it up later, but I've harmed myself. There is a harm that comes to society because when people do not pray, there are certain blessings that that house, that neighborhood, that city is deprived of. But that harm is not immediate and is not direct. When a person does not pay zakat, even if they postpone it, then there is somebody who had the right to receive that zakat, and they have been deprived, and they might actually suffer a great deal. Or, if it's an extreme case, they may even leave this world. So Allah wants us to have an appreciation of the material effects of zakat as well, so that if it's not enough for us to do it for the right reasons, at least because of our material self-interest, we will give zakat. So this is a hadith of our sixth Imam, Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam. It should not be a motivation for giving zakat, but it should be a reflection and a recognition to us that we do not gain anything by withholding zakat. The Imam says that مَا مِن مُؤْمِنٍ يَمْنَعُ دِرْهَمًا مِنْ حَقٍّ إِلَّا أَنْفَقَ اثْنَيْنِ فِي غَيْرِ حَقِّهِ وَمَا مِن رَجُلٍ يَمْنَعُ حَقًّا مِنْ مَالِهِ إِلَّا طَوَّقَهُ اللَّهُ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ حَيَّةً مِنْ نَارٍ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ. That if there is a believer who has an obligation to give, zakat or another obligation to give, and says that, well, let me withhold that obligation, maybe I might need this money. I might have use of it in the future. The hadith says that Allah will make that person spend twice as much in some other area if they withhold what they were to spend in the right area. So first of all, they will be deprived of the reward and the blessings. Second, they will have a sin. And instead of that ounce of prevention, they will also have to pay the entire pound afterwards. So that is a material incentive that we have to give zakat, although that is not the reason why we should do so. What is the reason behind zakat? It is not something that actually belongs to us in our own wealth. Numerous ahadith specify that Allah looked at the assets of the wealthy, and He decided what amount of those assets would be required in order to fulfill the needs of those who are needy. And then He appointed that percentage or that amount to be the property of the needy. So those who are given the zakat, they are sahibul haq. They are the ones who have the right to it. And I am merely conveying it to them. It is not really part of my property. And if zakat has become due on me, and I delay it or I do not give it, then in reality I am not spending my own property. There is a theft that has occurred. It's a theft because that belongs to somebody else, even if I haven't taken it from somebody else, but I am no less a thief, no less a sariq than if I had actually gone into some poor person's house and stolen whatever meager possessions they have. That zakat, it belongs to them. And when a person withholds zakat, then there is a hadith of our sixth Imam. He says that إِذَا مُنِعَتِ الزَّكَاةِ مَنَعَتِ الْأَرْضُ بَرَكَاتِهَا. That when people withhold zakat, not only is it an act of theft from the poor to the wealthy, but also it deprives the entirety of humanity of many blessings that Allah would give if that obligation were performed properly. Now there is an etiquette in how we are to give zakat. And that etiquette is to do several things. Part of it is to remind us that we should not give too much credit to ourselves for things that are an act of obligation and duty. Part of it also is to encourage society to maintain certain principles within it. One of those etiquettes is mentioned for zakat, but it is something which is very general for all acts of worship. It is mentioned in a hadith of Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam. He says that كُلَّمَا فَرَضَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْكَ فَإِعْلَانُهُ أَفْضَلْ مِنْ إِسْرَارِهِ. That everything that Allah has made an obligation for you to do so publicly is better than to do so privately. The daily prayers, don't go into a basement of your house to say your daily prayers. Do so publicly. If Allah has made it an obligation to go for Hajj, then at least if you are among Muslims who know what Hajj is, don't say that you're taking some time off. Say that you are going for Hajj. Announce it. Let people know. If you are giving zakat, which is an obligation, then don't say that, well, I am taking a deduction. Give your zakat publicly. Let it be known. Society should know that there is an expectation among Muslims that a person will pray, that a person will make time and will make the expense and go for Hajj, that a Muslim does fast, and Muslims don't take the month of Ramadan lightly, that Muslims do pay zakat. إعلانه أفضل من إسراره وكلما كان تطوعا فإسراره أفضل من إعلانه كل ما كان تطوعا فإسراره أفضل من إعلانه. Everything that is voluntary, that is extra, in those it is better to not mention it. So if you happen to fast Sha'ban and Rajab, then don't announce that like you would announce and publicly fast in the month of Ramadan. If you are going for a recommended act of pilgrimage, then you don't need to make that same announcement. You don't need to hide it, but you don't need to publicize it in the same way. Zakat, you should do publicly. But what sadaqah you give voluntarily beyond zakat, it's better to do so in secret. Now there might be certain cases where that is reversed, but the general rule is that the fara'id of Allah should be done publicly because they are the sha'a'ir of our religion. They are the ma'alim of our religion. Meaning they are the signposts, they are the guideposts, they are part of the identity of our religion. And we want to encourage that to be an expectation that exists within society. Those expectations are healthy because they will allow everybody to be able to better and easier practice our Islamic obligations and devotions. When we say that zakat is to be given publicly, though, it isn't to be noted that that means that you are to remove zakat from your property publicly. It doesn't mean that you should invite a press conference when you go and give the zakat to a needy person. The giving of it is separate. That should be done in a way which is honorable and which is dignified, as we will see in the teachings of the Imams. There is a companion of our fifth Imam, Asim ibn Humayd. He said that I asked Imam Baqir that رَجُلٌ مِّنْ أَصْحَابِنَا يَسْتَحِي أَنْ يَأْخُذَ مِنَ الزَّكَاةِ فَأُعْطِيهِ مِنَ الزَّكَاةِ وَلَا أُسَمِّي لَهُ أَنَّهَا مِنَ الزَّكَاةِ. There are some people who are followers of Ahlul Bayt, but they would be embarrassed if I told them that I'm giving this to you as sadaqah. They would be embarrassed if I told them that I'm giving this to you as zakat. So can I give that person with the intention of zakat, but not mention it to them? Say it is, for example, a gift. Maybe make some other excuse that this is for the children, this is for your home, this is something that I received and I wanted to share it with you, or I thought about you. Can you make some other excuse when you want to give zakat? Or do you have to say that this is zakat that I'm giving you, be aware of it, and make that explicit? The Imam said that أَعْطِهِ وَلَا تُسَمِّ لَهُ وَلَا تُذِلَّ الْمُؤْمِنِ. That give him, and don't mention to him that it is zakat. And do not do anything لَا تُذِلَّ الْمُؤْمِنِ. Don't do anything which would bring down a mu'min, which would make them feel embarrassed or ashamed. And we have, of course, in Surah Al-Baqarah, the verse of Quran which says, وَلَا تُبْطِلُوا صَدَقَاتِكُمْ بِالْمَنِّ وَالْأَذَى. That don't invalidate your sadaqat, your acts of kindness and charity, بِالْمَنِّ وَالْأَذَى, by lording it over a person or disturbing them or bothering them. There are different examples that have been given of what man and adha mean. One tafsir which has been mentioned is that when I do man, when I tell somebody that I have done this ihsan to you, I have done this kindness to you, that is by mentioning it. If I helped somebody in the past, then I should have forgotten about it by the moment that that is done. But when I mention it in the past, then that is lording it over that person. And adha, disturbing or bothering them, is to publicize it. That will hurt that person for others to know that they needed to seek assistance from somebody else. So any form of lording it over, any form of hurting or disturbing a person who has been helped, that is man wa adha, and it is something which invalidates our good deeds. What other things can we bear in mind in order to properly appreciate how to fulfill zakat? One thing is to remember that you never give zakat to any individual. It is their right, but you never are the one to convey it to that person. الصدقة تقع في يد الله قبل أن تقع في يد السائل. That sadaqah, it goes into the hand of Allah before it goes into the hand of the person who has solicited it or who has received it. Allah is the one that you are giving to, and if you think that you have done someone a favor, then tell Allah that you have added to His treasures, that you have assisted him when he was down on his luck and needy, if you have that courage to say that to Allah. Because the sadaqah that you give, you are giving it to Allah. Allah is the one that conveys it to that person. You are not conveying it to that person. Just that image and that reminder is something which can protect a person from ever becoming arrogant or ever feeling like I have the right to lord it over to somebody that, remember, I helped you back then. Because I did not give it to that person, I gave it to Allah. And Allah's treasures are, just in case we need a reminder, infinite. We're not adding anything to Allah. If He had wanted, He could have helped that person by any one of an infinite number of means. And one other hadith that I will mention, a person came to our sixth Imam, Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam. He says that سأله رجل في كم تجب الزكاة من المال. How much money do you need to have in order to be obligated to give zakat? Zakat is of different forms. It is on 9 different types of assets. The Imam said that الزكاة الظاهرة أم الباطنة تريد. Are you looking for the apparent zakat or the inner zakat? The person said that أريدهما جميعا. I want to know both. So first the Imam mentioned one of the levels of zakat في كل أمس 25. That it is 1/40 of your assets. If you have 1,000, then you will give 25. That is the amount of zakat that you will have on gold and silver coins. There is an amount of zakat that is on certain grains and on certain livestock as well. But then the Imam says that وَأَمَّا الْبَاطِنَ فَلَا تَسْتَأْثِرْ عَلَىٰ أَخِيكَ بِمَا هُوَ أَحْوَجُ إِلَيْهِ مِنْكَ. Anytime you have something and you see that a fellow believer or a brother has a greater need of that thing than you do, لا تستأثر على أخيك. Don't give yourself and think that your soul is more important than that person. When you see somebody else has a greater need, then share it with that person. And that doesn't mean that you have to give away everything that you have. Sharing can mean lending. It can mean giving a loan. It can mean giving another form of assistance, and it can also mean giving away and giving charity. But to have that sense that if I have something and I see somebody who has a greater need of it, then I have an obligation, ethically and spiritually, if not legally, to help them. That will always remind us that whatever we actually do end up giving in zakat, it is only a drop in the bucket of what we should be doing. And so our ideals are always right. Our effort will always be to increase our giving and to increase our humility, because we will realize how much less we are doing than we could do and than we should do. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to fulfill our obligation in the legal sense and also in our broader ethical sense, and may He allow all of us to achieve that purification, which is the purpose for which zakat and our other acts of worship have been legislated. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.